My business partner had me sign what he called routine paperwork. Buried on page 14 was a clause transferring my entire ownership stake to him for $1. I found out 3 weeks later, when I was locked out of our own company's bank account. Tonight, every single story is about a betrayal from someone trusted completely. In the workplace, 5 careers, 5 betrayals, 5 people who fought back. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. Story 1 begins. My name is Nathan. I am 43 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and 14 months ago I discovered that my business partner of 9 years had, 3 weeks earlier, had me sign a document during what he described as routine paperwork related to a bank refinancing that actually transferred my entire 50% ownership stake in our company to him for the nominal sum of $1. A transfer I only discovered when I attempted to access our business bank account for an unrelated matter and found myself locked out entirely. My business partner's name is Gregory. We had co-founded a landscaping and property management company 9 years earlier, building it from a 2-person operation into a business with 15 employees and a solid regional reputation. An operation I had always believed was built on genuine mutual trust and equal partnership. I want to describe the specific circumstances of the signing, because the deception required careful planning to execute successfully. Gregory had approached me on a Friday afternoon, during a particularly busy period when we were juggling several large contracts simultaneously, explaining that our bank required updated signatures on file for a refinancing of our business line of credit, a routine-sounding request given that we had refinanced various business loans several times over our 9 years together. He presented me with a stack of papers, several pages thick, explaining generally what each section covered while I was distracted managing a phone call about a client issue, and I signed where indicated, trusting as I had for 9 years, that Gregory was accurately representing what I was signing. I want to describe the moment I discovered what had actually happened, because it took several confused, increasingly alarming steps before I fully understood the situation. Unable to access our business account online, I called our bank directly, initially assuming a technical error, only to be told that the account's ownership structure had been formally updated 3 weeks earlier, based on documentation showing my complete transfer of ownership to Gregory, documentation that included my genuine signature on what I now understood had been buried within that stack of papers I had signed without reading carefully enough during that Friday afternoon confrontation. With 2 competing crises, I contacted an attorney immediately, and together we reviewed the actual documents I had signed, finding, exactly as the bank had described, a formal ownership transfer agreement, my signature clearly present on the final page, transferring my entire stake for $1, a transaction so nominal it was clearly designed to satisfy legal formality requirements for a transfer rather than representing any genuine payment for what was, by any reasonable business valuation, a company worth well over $1 million given our client base, equipment, and annual revenue. I want to describe the specific financial and personal impact this situation had already created before we were able to resolve it, because Gregory had, in the 3 weeks since this transfer, begun making unilateral decisions about the company's direction, including terminating 2 long-term employees I had personally hired and considered valuable team members, decisions that would have required my input under our original partnership agreement, but that Gregory now claimed full authority to make independently given his newly established sole ownership. Update 4 months later. I filed a formal lawsuit against Gregory within the first month after this discovery, my attorney building a case around fraudulent inducement, arguing that Gregory had deliberately buried the ownership transfer within seemingly routine paperwork, specifically to prevent me from carefully reviewing what I was actually signing. A claim supported by the nominal $1 consideration. which no reasonable business valuation could justify for an actual equal partnership transfer. The legal process took considerable time, complicated by Gregory's attorney initially arguing that I had simply failed to read documents I had voluntarily signed, a defense that became harder to sustain once my attorney presented evidence of the specific circumstances Gregory had engineered, including text messages from that Friday showing Gregory deliberately timing the signing request during a period he knew I was distracted with other business matters, messages that had been recovered through the discovery process and that painted a clear picture of premeditation, rather than any innocent administrative oversight on Gregory's part. The court ultimately ruled in my favor, finding sufficient evidence of fraudulent inducement to void the transfer and restore my original 50% ownership stake, though the litigation costs and the fundamental breach of trust have made continuing as business partners with Gregory practically and emotionally impossible. We are currently in the process of formally dissolving our partnership, with a court-appointed mediator helping structure either a buyout or a formal split of the company's assets and client relationships, a process expected to take several more months given the complexity of untangling 9 years of intertwined business operations, shared equipment, and long-standing client relationships that both of us have contributed to building over nearly a decade of genuine, if ultimately betrayed, professional partnership. Gregory buried a betrayal inside routine paperwork. And just like Nathan discovered his betrayal through a locked bank account, the woman in story 2 discovered hers through something she found during an ordinary performance review. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what she found. My name is Jennifer. I am 38 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and 11 months ago I discovered, through a records request I filed with our company's HR department during an unrelated dispute about my own promotion history, that my direct manager had been systematically presenting my original ideas and completed projects as her own contributions during executive leadership presentations for the preceding 3 years, a practice that had contributed to her receiving 2 promotions during the same period I had remained in essentially the same role despite consistently strong individual performance reviews. My manager's name is Susan. I had worked under her direct supervision for the entire duration of these 3 years, a reporting structure that had made it relatively easy, I came to realize, for her to present my work in executive settings I was never invited to attend, settings where she could control the narrative entirely about who had actually originated and executed the projects being discussed. I want to describe how I discovered this, because it required a specific set of circumstances to fully uncover. I had requested documentation related to several projects I had personally led, initially just trying to build a stronger case for my own overdue promotion. And in reviewing internal presentation materials I had separately requested through a colleague in another department, I began noticing slide decks and executive summaries that described projects I had personally designed and executed, using language and specific data points that closely mirrored my own project documentation, but presented entirely under Susan's name with no mention of my involvement whatsoever. Despite these presentations being delivered to the exact executive committee, whose approval would have been directly relevant to my own promotion consideration, I want to describe one specific instance that became the clearest example, because it illustrates the pattern well. 18 months earlier, I had developed a new client retention strategy that had measurably improved our department's numbers, a project I had documented extensively in emails to Susan and in formal project reports I had submitted through our tracking system. In an executive presentation from that same period, which I obtained through my records request, this exact strategy was described, using strikingly similar language to my own original documentation, as an initiative Susan had personally developed and implemented, with no mention of my involvement despite the clear documentation trail, showing the strategy had originated entirely with me, and that Susan's actual role had been limited to approving a project I had already designed independently. I gathered comprehensive documentation of at least 5 similar instances across the 3-year period, compiling original project reports, emails, and timestamps alongside the executive presentation materials that mirrored or directly appropriated these contributions, before bringing this evidence to HR and to Susan's own supervisor, requesting a formal investigation into what I believed constituted a sustained pattern of taking credit for work that was not hers. Update 4 months later. The HR investigation confirmed the pattern I had documented, interviewing several colleagues who had worked on the relevant projects and who corroborated that the strategies and results in question had indeed originated primarily with me rather than Susan. Though the investigation also revealed a somewhat more complicated picture than pure fabrication, finding that Susan had, in a few instances, made genuine secondary contributions to implementation that, while real, did not justify the extent to which she had presented herself as the primary originator across multiple executive presentations over 3 years. The company's response included a formal warning placed in Susan's personnel file, a requirement that she issue a written acknowledgement of my original contributions for the specific instances documented, and a review of her most recent promotion, which was ultimately not rescinded, but was accompanied by additional oversight of her future project claims. I was not offered retroactive promotion or compensation for the 3 years during which my contributions had been effectively obscured, a decision from leadership that I found frustrating, but that HR indicated was difficult to formally address, given the informal nature of how the original credit had been allocated in executive settings I had never been present for. I did receive a genuine promotion 4 months after this investigation concluded, into a role that reports directly to a different manager, and my working relationship with Susan has been entirely severed at a functional level, an arrangement our department implemented specifically to avoid further disputes. Susan has not offered any personal apology beyond the formally required written acknowledgement, continuing to characterize the situation, in conversations other colleagues have relayed to me, as an unfair pile-on rather than a genuine reckoning with 3 years of taking credit for work that was not her own. Susan built 3 years of borrowed credit through meetings Jennifer never had access to. Our third story tonight is about a betrayal that was not built slowly, over years. It happened through a single email sent to every single client a company had ever had. This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Daniel. I am 46 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And 7 months ago I discovered that my former business partner, following our company's difficult dissolution 3 months earlier, had sent a carefully worded email to every single one of our shared clients, fabricating an account of why our partnership had ended that painted me as professionally unreliable, and suggested clients should transition their business exclusively to his newly established solo practice rather than considering continuing with me independently as I had been attempting to establish following our split. My former business partner's name is Gerald. We had built our consulting firm together over 15 years, and while our partnership dissolution had certainly been difficult and involved genuine disagreements about the company's future direction, I had believed we had ultimately parted on reasonably professional terms, an assumption that was completely shattered once I discovered the specific content of what he had actually been telling our former clients. I want to describe how I discovered this email, because it happened when a former client, someone I had personally worked with for over a decade and had assumed would naturally continue working with me given our long, positive professional history, contacted me with obvious confusion, forwarding an email Gerald had sent that I had never seen, asking whether the concerning issues it described were accurate before they made any decision about future business arrangements. I want to describe reading this email for the first time, discovering that Gerald had fabricated an elaborate, entirely false narrative suggesting our partnership had ended due to what he characterized as my declining professional performance and reliability issues, details that were completely invented and bore no resemblance whatsoever to the actual, legitimate business disagreements that had genuinely led to our dissolution. The email specifically suggested that clients would be better served transitioning entirely to Gerald's new solo practice, explicitly discouraging them from considering continued work with me by implying, through fabricated details, that my own professional capabilities had genuinely declined in ways that made me an unreliable choice going forward. I want to describe the process of understanding the full scope of what Gerald had done, because this was not simply one email to one client but rather, as I discovered through careful investigation, a systematic communication sent to every single client relationship our firm had built over 15 years, potentially causing significant damage to my own ability to establish a successful independent practice by preemptively poisoning these relationships with entirely fabricated concerns about my professional reliability. I want to describe the specific business and financial impact this fabricated communication had already begun causing by the time I discovered it, because several clients, having received Gerald's email before I had any opportunity to provide my own accurate account of our partnership's dissolution, had already made decisions to transition their business relationships exclusively to Gerald's new practice, decisions made based on entirely false information about my supposed professional decline that Gerald had strategically distributed before I even knew any communication of this kind was occurring. Update: 4 months later, I filed a formal lawsuit against Gerald for business defamation and tortious interference with business relationships, a legal process that required extensive documentation of both the fabricated claims themselves and their demonstrable financial impact on my independent practice's ability to retain client relationships that should have naturally continued given our long, positive professional history together. The legal process has been lengthy and complex, though my attorney has expressed confidence in the case given the clear documentation of Gerald's fabricated claims alongside evidence definitively establishing that our partnership's actual dissolution involved legitimate business disagreements, rather than any performance issues on my part whatsoever. Several of the clients who had initially transitioned to Gerald based on his fabricated communication have, once I was able to provide them with accurate information about what had actually occurred, expressed significant discomfort with having been deceived, with several formally providing statements supporting my legal case, and explicitly stating they would not have made their transition decisions had they possessed accurate information, rather than Gerald's fabricated account. I continue working to rebuild my independent practice, a process that has been considerably more difficult than it should have been given Gerald's preemptive interference, though the legal proceedings and the willingness of several affected clients to provide supportive testimony has provided some measure of validation regarding the genuine harm his fabricated communications caused to a reputation I had spent 15 years building through legitimate, consistent professional work. Gerald tried to destroy 15 years of Daniel's reputation with one email. Our fourth story tonight is about a betrayal that happened not through paperwork or emails, but through a colleague who had access to something far more sensitive: company financial records. Wait, let that sink in. Here is what happened. My name is Andrew. I am 34 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and 9 months ago I discovered that a co-worker on our finance team had been using confidential company earnings data, information she had legitimate access to as part of her role, but was strictly prohibited from acting on personally, to make personal stock trades ahead of public earnings announcements for approximately 2 years, a discovery I made accidentally while helping her troubleshoot a technical issue on her work computer, and noticing a personal trading account open in a background browser tab that displayed trade timing suspiciously aligned with information I knew she had access to days before it became public. My co-worker's name is Lisa. We had worked on the same finance team for 4 years, and I want to describe the specific circumstances of this discovery, being asked to help resolve a software issue on her computer during a busy afternoon. Noticing, while working through this unrelated technical problem, a browser tab displaying what was clearly a personal brokerage account, open trades visible that included transactions in our own company's stock timed in ways that immediately struck me as concerning given my own knowledge of when certain non-public earnings information typically became available internally before public release. That I want to describe what I did once I noticed this. Not saying anything immediately, but making a mental note of the specific timing pattern I had glimpsed, later cross-referencing, through legitimate access to historical earnings announcement dates, whether Lisa's apparent trading pattern actually aligned with these dates in ways that would suggest genuine insider trading rather than any coincidental, legitimate investment strategy. I want to describe what this research revealed, finding a consistent pattern across what I could observe of her trading history. Purchases made in the days immediately before positive earnings surprises were announced, and sales made just before negative announcements. A pattern occurring with a frequency and precision that felt genuinely implausible as random chance rather than reflecting actual advanced knowledge of information she had legitimate professional access to but was strictly prohibited from using for personal financial benefit. I want to describe the difficult internal conflict I experienced before deciding how to proceed, understanding that Lisa was not just a co-worker, but someone I had considered a genuine work friend over our 4 years together, making the decision to report what I had observed considerably more emotionally complicated than if this had involved someone I had less personal connection to, while also understanding that insider trading represented a serious legal and ethical violation that I could not simply ignore once I had genuine reason to believe it was occurring. Update 4 months later. I reported my observations to our company's compliance department, providing the specific timing pattern I had documented, which prompted a formal internal investigation that was subsequently escalated to actual regulatory authorities, given the serious nature of the potential securities violations involved. This investigation confirmed that Lisa had indeed been engaging in insider trading based on non-public company information for approximately 2 years. Trades that had generated substantial personal profit through information she was legally and contractually prohibited from using this way. Lisa was terminated from the company immediately once this investigation's findings were confirmed, and she is currently facing formal regulatory proceedings that could result in significant financial penalties and potential criminal charges given the sustained, deliberate nature of the violations documented. My relationship with Lisa, understandably, ended completely following this report. She has characterized my actions, through mutual colleagues, as an unnecessary betrayal of a workplace friendship, a characterization I have had to make peace with, understanding that reporting genuine securities violations, regardless of personal relationships involved, represented the only appropriate response once I had credible evidence of what was actually occurring, even though the personal cost of that decision, losing what I had genuinely valued as a meaningful work friendship, has been considerably more difficult to process than I might have anticipated before actually facing this specific situation. Andrew's discovery ended. A friendship and exposed. 2 years of securities fraud. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a betrayal that targeted something even more personal than a career. A mentor who had spent years building someone up, only to try tearing them back down. This is the last story. Here is what happened. My name is Michael. I am 40 years old. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and 8 months ago I discovered, through a technical glitch on a professional review platform that briefly revealed reviewer account information that should have remained anonymous, that my longtime professional mentor had been writing anonymous negative reviews of my independent consulting work for approximately 3 years. Criticisms that had appeared periodically on industry platforms where potential clients researched consultants before hiring. Reviews I had always assumed, when I noticed them at all, came from genuinely dissatisfied former clients rather than from someone who had, throughout this same period, continued presenting herself as my professional champion and advocate. My mentor's name is Susan. She had guided my early career for over 8 years, providing genuine, valuable mentorship during my first several years in the consulting field. Mentorship I had always credited significantly for my eventual professional success and independence. I want to describe the technical glitch that revealed this information, because it was genuinely accidental rather than any deliberate investigation on my part. A platform update that briefly displayed reviewer account details that were supposed to remain permanently hidden. Details I happened to notice while reviewing my own professional profile for an unrelated update, recognizing Susan's account information attached to 3 separate negative reviews I had previously read without any idea of their actual source. I want to describe what it felt like to understand that reviews I had read over the preceding 3 years, reviews that had specifically criticized aspects of my work in ways that felt, even at the time, somewhat inconsistent with actual client feedback I had received directly, had actually come from my own mentor, someone who had continued, throughout this same period, taking public credit for my professional development and presenting our relationship, in industry circles, as an ongoing mentorship success story. I want to describe the confrontation that followed once I had confirmed this discovery through additional careful research, presenting Susan with the account information I had briefly glimpsed before the platform corrected its glitch. Watching her attempt initial denial before the specificity of what I had seen made continued denial impossible to sustain credibly. Her eventual explanation centered on what she described as growing professional insecurity, as my independent success had begun to eclipse her own consulting practice in certain market segments. Insecurity, she said, had led her, gradually and in ways she claimed even surprised herself, toward actions designed to subtly undermine my growing reputation while maintaining, in every direct interaction between us, the supportive mentor relationship I had always believed was genuine and uncomplicated. Update: 4 months later. I ended my professional relationship with Susan immediately following this discovery, and have spent considerable time since working to address the reputational damage her anonymous reviews caused, including reaching out directly to several clients I believe may have seen these reviews during their decision-making process, providing additional references and context that several told me they appreciated, given that the reviews in question had struck some of them as somewhat vague or inconsistent with Susan's own separately expressed public praise for my work, an inconsistency that, in retrospect, several potential clients told me had actually raised some quiet doubts about the review's authenticity even before I understood their true source. I have not pursued any formal legal action against Susan, my attorney advising that proving quantifiable damages from anonymous online reviews would be difficult despite the clear ethical violation involved. Though I have shared what I discovered with several mutual professional contacts, understanding that this information, once known, would likely affect how others in our industry perceive Susan's own professional integrity going forward, a natural consequence I have made peace with rather than actively pursuing further consequences myself beyond simply no longer protecting information I have no continued obligation to keep private given how thoroughly she violated the trust our professional relationship had been built upon. That's all 5 stories tonight. If any of these hit close to home, let me know in the comments below. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. A like helps YouTube show this to more people who might need to hear it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.